Right, well, I have changed the title slightly. It started off as Shelley Potteries and Art Deco, and I broadened it a little bit to make it Shelley Potteries in the Art Deco era, because I found that there was an awful lot of pottery that showed some Art Deco characteristics, and I honestly wasn't sure whether it was Art Deco or not, because a lot of the pictures are not of my pieces. And what we're going to do is give you some Art Deco background, then some Shelley background, and then look at some pictures from Shelley China and Shelley earthenware. A bit of Art Deco background. It was prominent in the mid-1920s in particular to the 1930s. It usually has very precise and boldly geometric lineation and strong colors and stylized patterns, and it was notable in architecture and household furniture and houses particularly. 1920, modernism began. What brought it to public attention most was, I think, a 1925 exhibition in Paris. It spread in the 30s and popularity declined, some resurgence. It remains collectible, and the fact that it remains collectible is a little bit of a problem for Shelley collectors, because there are a lot of other people who collect just Art Deco, and so the prices seem to be usually fairly high. And I found it quite hard to define the boundaries of Art Deco, because it's a lot of styles, and it's sometimes a bit unclear to me, at least, whether something is Art Deco or simply has some Art Deco characteristics. On ceramics, usually has some stylized motifs, geometric shapes and patterns, strong colors, and here are a few Shelley examples. Some Shelley background. There was a short trade boom after the First World War, and Shelley added some kilns and some factory area, expanded. But as you'd all know, in the 1920s, it was a time of economic disaster. Wall Street crash, which I think was about 1927, Great Depression, and there were, I'll just point out a couple of name changes. Wildman and Company finally became Shelley's. The Shelley family had controlled Wildman and Company since the late 1800s, but didn't change the name until 1925, and then in 1929 made another name change to Shelley Potteries, and it remained that until it was taken over in 1966. But even though it was a time of considerable economic downturn, Shelley Potteries remained successful. They did this by making high quality products. They really improved the quality of their china. They had a vigorous promotion scheme going. They brought in many new designs, significant exports, and what they really did, I think, was aimed at the middle and upper classes, who were probably not as badly affected by the Depression as people down the bottom end. Their promotion often used a lady from the times, the Shelley girl or Shelley lady, and it appeared in a lot of features. And a notable catalogue in 1931 was what's known as the Silver Book. And you'll see the cover says Modern Shelley China, New Lines of Beauty on one of the pages inside, and I've added in a page of Vogue, because there are a number of pages of Vogue patterns and so on, which they'd introduced in the early 1930s. Who designed these? Walter Slater was art director in 1905, but his son Eric Slater is the one that's given most of the credit, and he became art director in 1937, but he, as I said, is credited with much of Shelley's Art Deco range, and he was known for matching patterns to shapes. Now let's have a look at some of the wares during this period. In the early 1920s, there are patterns appearing with some Art Deco features. on existing shapes. Mid-1920s, they brought in some new shapes, some new Art Deco patterns. 30s was a notable period because that's when Vogue and Mode and Eve and a number of shapes that are clearly Art Deco shapes were used with a lot of Art Deco patterns. There, of course, is Vogue, Mode, Eve, and Regent. But during this period, of course, they also made more conservative shapes and patterns, florals and things like that. They tried to cater for a wide market. And I'd now like to show you some pictures of some china from the Art Deco era. Now, in 1921, that's a very geometric pattern, although I don't think you can call it Art Deco. The colours are muted and so on, but they certainly moved towards a few more geometric patterns in that time. And again, the same in 1922 of the butterfly border, where they had a geometric patterns around the rim and highly stylized butterflies. In the 1930s, they were putting Art Deco patterns on some older shapes, Vincent, for example, which started in 1916. And there are a few very early patterns that they later adapted and used with their Art Deco wares. And one example is Tudor apple rather, on earthenware. It wasn't named on China, but it did get translated over to China, and there's a 1913 mocha cup. And there's a Mode cup to which they adapted the pattern. And again, you can see that some of their geometric patterns, I don't know whether you'd call all of these Art Deco, although they're some of them quite strong colours. Certainly the bottom two, I think, probably qualify. In this period, they were using several children's artists. One was Hilda Cowan, and some of her ladies or little girls that she used as patterns had quite a bit of geometry in them. And I'm not quite sure whether you'd call these Art Deco, but they're certainly from the Art Deco period. In this period, they introduced a number of cups. Queen Anne was quite geometric, but probably doesn't really qualify as Art Deco, but certainly Vogue in 1930 and Mode and Eve, Regent, getting a little bit further away, and Princess were all from this period, and a lot of them appeared with a lot of Art Deco patterns. Queen Anne, briefly, came in 3 different cup shapes, as you know, coffee, tall, and it evolved out of antique and used the same teapot, the antique teapot, as at the top right and at Queen Anne at the bottom. And you can see they put a few scallops in, slightly reduced and changed the plate size, but not so different. But it was a fairly geometric shape, and it got a bit of a serve in the silver book, a whole page of them. You can see that the picture at the bottom shows a very Art Deco pattern. The other 2 stylized trees and so on were certainly patterns from the 1920s, but whether they should be regarded as Art Deco, I honestly don't know. But there's Crabtree, and it was certainly very stylized, certainly some geometry in the fruit, and certainly some of the colours are fairly strong. But Art Deco patterns were used on Queen Anne, and here's a couple of examples. And I mentioned that they also introduced floral handles at this time for Queen Anne. Some of the patterns may qualify as Art Deco. The colours or the geometry of the bottom pair in the middle probably qualify as Art Deco. Some of the others certainly had some Art Deco features. But now to what are indisputably Art Deco. Vogue was registered in July 1930. Mode was introduced several months later, and they shared a registration number, and they also shared all the bits that went with it, the saucers, plates, and so on. And a very popular pattern, apparently, because it's found in some abundance, sunray and its variations. And you'll note that on Vogue, the wider cup, they put the pattern inside the cup. On Mode, the one at bottom right, narrower, they put the pattern on the outside of the cup. But it came in a number of different colorways. And Vogue, some geometric patterns. The small jugs often had closed handles, the larger ones open. And a few more Vogue. Now, I don't know whether the monocolor one or with gilding inside, top left, qualifies as Art Deco, but certainly the shape is Art Deco, and the colors are fairly strong, so it probably does. And a couple of shared coffee cups for Vogue and Mode with Art Deco patterns. And they introduced a fruit handle, which seems to be quite rare because I've only know of two examples. One used to belong to Gary Hoare. I'm not quite sure where it is now, the top left, and the one on the right, obviously a coloured version. And Dainty also, from this Art Deco period, introduced some floral handles. The shape is, of course, very old, but or for Shelley, but it had quite a strong geometric pattern in the coffee set on the left. Whether that qualifies as Art Deco, I'm not quite sure, but it certainly had some Art Deco characteristics. Mode, here a part of the tea set from the 1930. It ran right through the mid-1930s and had a number of designs and a number of patterns. And there is a sunray with a coffee cup, a coffee pot. And this one is interesting because I think it does show how patterns were modified slightly to suit the shape. You'll see that the J foot goes to the left on most of those pieces, but on the plates, obviously to suit the curved center better, the J flips the other way. Butterfly wing came in a few different colors, and I don't know that it was as popular because you don't see as many around, but it was quite a spectacular pattern. And a few more Mode with Art Deco patterns. Now, the Bluebird has some geometric motifs on the down at the bottom of the pieces, and I'm told qualifies as Art Deco, a fairly highly stylized bird. And I'm not sure whether the bottom right should be regarded as Art Deco or not, although it's on an Art Deco shape. Now, Vogue, supposedly, because of the wide cup, the tea cooled fairly quickly. Mode was better, but still hard to hang on to, and the handles tended to get a bit hot. So they modified it to put on a foot and an open handle, which probably made it much easier to hold. Now, I was a bit surprised to find that it wasn't a shape unique to Shelley. Way back in 1876, company George Jones was making a shape that is not dissimilar. And Albert Jones, which I think was one of the bits that grew out eventually of George Jones after a few name changes, had a shape that was very, very similar to Eve. And some Eve examples, geometrics featured quite prominently. And here are some patterns, some clearly Art Deco, but others from the Art Deco era. And I'm never quite sure how you should regard one at the bottom left, which is highly stylized and pretty geometric, but whether that qualifies as Art Deco, some of you might like to express an opinion later. And bottom right is one of the Harmony dripware patterns where they obviously still use the strong colors, which seem to have been pretty popular at the time. And so it has some Art Deco characteristics. And again, some more of these florals, which I'm not quite sure whether the purists regard this as Art Deco, but certainly the cup shapes are. A brief word about teapots. The teapots for Vogue and coffee pots for Vogue and Mode on the left, and some of them had a closed handle, some of them had an open handle. Moved to Eve, and the only real change was to put in a curved spout. And then, of course, Regent, which had a curved pot shape and a ring handle. You could get breakfast sets in a number of these shapes, and Eve was one of them. And lemonade sets, stylish jugs. And Regent, a few patterns from Regent. There was a coffee and a tea. A number of the patterns were clearly Art Deco. And you can see the hot water jug along with a coffee pot. Now, these patterns are getting a bit further away from Art Deco. They're still very geometric, but the colours are more muted. Another Regent. The one on the right seems to be moving well away from Art Deco, a less formal, less geometric pattern. I have put the one on the right in because it does show that there were two different plate shapes used. I have sometimes been asked whether it is the correct plate shape, but they're both found marked with the Regent shape letter W, so presumably that was what was intended by the factory. And another shape, Princess, came in a bit later, and some of its patterns are Art Deco, including this lot. That's certainly not an Art Deco pattern, but I included this just to show that they use the same teapot and coffee pots as Art Deco, as Queen Anne. And during this time, Walter Slater devised a series known as the Ladies Series, 12 patterns. And some of them show ladies from the period. The 1930s brooch, in a reference, is claimed to be Art Deco, so I'm not quite sure whether the lady from this series is quite stylized enough to qualify as Art Deco, but I suspect it does. These are the 6 ladies. There were another 6 which were from period costumes and so on, but these 6 all show young ladies from the time. Although I don't think, other than the lady with the greyhounds, that they really would qualify as Art Deco patterns. And just for finish off, I'd like to show a few other cup shapes from this period. They introduced Empire, Mayfair, York, Strand, Windsor, Oxford, and some of these ended up being used with Art Deco patterns, for example, Oxford. And York are 2 that I know of. There are probably others, but if they are, I haven't seen them. And then to complete the series, Mayfair, Cambridge, Devon, Kent, Ripon, but all getting well away from Art Deco. So they'd started to move away. And I included here Hyderabad because it's a very geometric shape, and I think would just about qualify as Art Deco. I had thought it was unique to the Nazim of Hyderabad, and certainly the teacups were, but the jug turns out to have been used rather earlier. At least 3 or 4 clients had them as barware, including the Greers I've shown there. Now look at the earthenware from the Art Deco era. Like China, there were what I'd regard as fringe Art Deco with some Art Deco features. And you can see how they moved into the area. butterfly vase on the left certainly doesn't qualify as Art Deco, and the foliage is almost Art Nouveau, I would have thought. But by the mid-1920s, they had simplified the butterfly and added geometric borders and gone for Art Deco colours. So these may be Art Deco, but they certainly share some Art Deco characteristics. And the same here, bright colours. The pattern on the left for the Sturt Desert Pea was presumably made for an Australian market, and it comes right in the middle in the pattern books, right in the middle of a whole series of Art Deco patterns. It's stylized Art Deco colours. The two on the right have some Art Deco features. And the same here, the birds ended up with some very, very strong colours and so on. I guess the colours of the time, although I don't think they would be regarded as Art Deco. They're fringe, but some of the kookaburras probably just about can. Kingfishers rather. They are stylized and some quite strident colours. They also made them as one with an orange luster, and the bowl on the right shows how it was done. It belongs to us, and the luster was so badly worn that I cleaned it right off, but it shows the complete pattern, the two kingfishers, and they put white resist on, then they sprayed it with blue, and then they eventually lustered it. Now, I'm never quite sure how these patterns should be regarded either, whether they are truly Art Deco. They're certainly very stylized. They certainly use some Art Deco colours, and they featured heavily in the 1920s. And that triangular vase was a pretty much geometric shape, perhaps qualifies as Art Deco. And a few more. And a few more. But there were plenty of pieces that were very definitely Art Deco, and here's a few lidded bowls. And some mid-1920s patterns, which I think meet all the criteria for Art Deco, including this bold pattern. Some lustered earthenware. Some of these patterns definitely Art Deco. Now these again have some characteristics. The ones on the left have the orange luster glaze, but they're a highly geometric pattern, but the colours are more subdued, so they only have some Art Deco features, I think. And the same with this one. And I just mentioned during this period, Mabel Lucy Atwell was also working for Shelley as a designer, or supplying designs more particularly. And she made quite a lot of teaware, and Hilda Cowan was also making teaware. And a couple of another Mabel Lucy Atwell, stylized, and I think that probably could just about be regarded as Art Deco. Another popular design, and tulips, clearly Art Deco. And some shapes, which were very geometric, although the patterns may not qualify. And I don't know what the one on the left is. It doesn't have a pattern number. I've not been able to find anything in the pattern book. So whether it was something done by one of the artists as a sort of apprentice piece, or whether it was an experiment, I don't know. And I have made very little mention of harmony, which became very popular in the late 1930s, but I don't regard that as Art Deco, although it used a lot of Art Deco shapes. The recycled pattern started off as Romanian Lusterware, and they took some of the elements of that. And I think that probably does qualify as Art Deco. And of course, it flowed over to things like tablewares and dinner services. And a few quaint jugs, which probably just about qualify. Certainly the one on the right is a dripware pattern, harmony, but it certainly uses the colours of the time, and the kingfisher, those bright colours. I'm not quite sure that it's a pretty geometric shape, although the quaint jugs were around for a long, long while. And a few table lamps, the two on the left obviously are not Art Deco, but I've included them because they came with a parchment shade or with a china shade. Not many of the china ones have survived intact, and a lot of the original parchment ones are missing anyway, but some of the shapes I think were Art Deco, including the one on the right, and I have no idea what its name is. And three of these were very geometric and probably match the Art Deco characteristics. And a little bit of Brewerania, just to finish. For those who collect Vogue, you might be interested to know that the jug shown on the left was made for two other companies as well, in different colorways and so on, and obviously different lettering, is called a Vogue jug. It's earthenware though, and the Arcadia one is a very geometric shape. Does that qualify as Art Deco? It's certainly something that's characteristic of the times. So I'd just like to summarise. First of all, I found the boundaries of Art Deco hard to define precisely, which is why I changed the title. In the Art Deco era, they made shapes and patterns for a wide range of tastes, and that included some clearly Art Deco, but it also included quite a lot that used strong colours or some Art Deco features. Mode and Vogue were at the forefront of Art Deco ceramics design, and they got quite a lot of praise at the time when they were introduced as design pieces, but maybe were not as practical for teaware. But they still feature in a number of major Art Deco collections. And a few years ago, when they had a big Art Deco display at our local art gallery, the National Art Gallery, they were the ceramics that were chosen to represent Art Deco. And the other thing I'd like to leave you with is that although the mid-20s to 40s were very difficult economic times, Shelley seems to have survived quite well, and after a few difficult years. And this was because they made very high quality china, strong marketing, and they did have strong export markets to Australia, Canada, and other places. Right, thank you. That's not quite only Art Deco, because I found that there were too many pieces I just wasn't sure about. So I leave you to make your own decisions about some of them. Thank you.